Hello everybody, it's me Scoop, and wow, I have not seen a movie as bad as Harold and the Purple Crayon in a really long time. This is the type of movie where it's not even fun for me to sit here and shit on it for like 30 to 40 straight minutes, because it's that uniquely 2010 to 2020 type of bad where it just has no soul. I swear to God, Sony Pictures checked their list of IPs, they saw Harold and the Purple Crayon, they pulled some random dudes off the street, held a gun to their head and said, "Make me a Harold and the Purple Crayon movie." So this thing here, this monstrosity, was written by the duo behind the worst of the three Night at the Museum movies, and the writers behind the worst Steve Carell Paul Rudd comedy I've ever seen. So we're off to a great start. However, Harold and the Purple Crayon was actually directed by the guy behind Ice Age 2 and 3 and the Rio movies, so he's really not that bad. I actually did a recent rewatch of the Ice Age movies, and they hold up pretty well into adulthood. But yeah, that clearly did not help this movie succeed at all. So this review will have spoilers in it because, let's be honest, the plot is paper thin at best, and you're not going to watch this movie anyway, guys. So there were three other people in the theater with me, an old couple and who I have to assume is their grandchild, and not a single laugh was shared in this theater, okay? This is pretty much the only audience I could imagine going to see Harold and the Purple Crayon in live action starring Zachary Levi, and they were dead silent the entire time. Although it was very impressive that they managed to clear their popcorn in about 10 minutes of the preview starting. They got that whole tub and they had to go refill it immediately. Far more impressive than anything I actually saw from the movie. I know I've said this a few times this summer already, but it really does feel like this movie was written with assistance from AI. Like, that is very, very possible. It's a little concerning. There are a lot of little things in here that just happen because movies have these little moments, but they don't make any sense. Like, for example, at the very end of the movie, Harold obviously has to go back to his book imaginary world thing. But on his way out, the little kid he's with the whole time hands him a box of like multicolored Crayola crayons, right? So you'd imagine that at some point during the movie, it would be sort of important, or they would have really any reference to the fact that Harold only draws in purple. But no, there's never any reference to the fact that Harold only draws in purple. So when he's handed the box of multicolored Crayola crayons at the very end of the movie, you feel absolutely nothing because they didn't even do the most basic amount of effort to set this up. This could have been a really sweet moment representative of Harold's journey throughout the film as he's sort of, grown a bit and he's expanded his mind, but it's just nothing. This is really the best way to describe Harold and the Purple Crayon. Things that happen in movies happen here, but all the things that make movies enjoyable, like logic and reason and setups and payoffs, completely absent here. It is really just baffling to me that this movie got made at all. Like, was there really no test footage of Zachary Levi as Harold where somebody took a look at this and said, "Hey, you know what? This really isn't working. Maybe we shouldn't make this movie." Is anyone else getting the really strong sense that Zachary Levi is playing a pedophile? And at that point, I don't even feel the need to critique the story or the filmmaking here, because at just the most surface level, this movie is hard to watch. Not in a great horror movie way, in a way where it's just really uncomfortable. I have never had this level of secondhand embarrassment from watching a film in a theater before. I wanted to leave. The jokes are just lame. Zachary Levi is really off-putting. Zooey Deschanel is here, and she could not care less. I mean, I hope she got a big fat paycheck for this because she deserves it for having to sit on set throughout this whole movie. The comic relief side character guy is not funny. He's kind of just there. The movie is just so bland and so uncomfortable. Although I do have to add the little porcupine girl, the other side character, the actress, she knew what the script called for, okay? I really don't know how to put it into words without being able to watch some of her scenes back and analyze her performance a bit more, but she was giving the proper energy for this type of role where she didn't come off as weird or creepy. She really felt like she was into it and she was doing a pretty solid job. Although whenever they edited in animal noises over her talking and doing little movements and stuff, that was immediately really weird and uncomfortable. I do have to give at least one positive, that the opening scene of Harold in his book imagination world is pretty fun and decently well animated with some cool camera movements and stuff. The very, very beginning is just a recap of the book, because obviously we need a recap of the thrilling story of Harold and the Purple Crayon. And it's by far the best part of the movie, which is pretty embarrassing. But at least like the extra 2 or 3 minutes after that that's still animated works pretty well. And Zachary Levi playing this character in animation is actually pretty good. Like his voice does fit the role. He has that sort of energy and childlike wonder in his voice that works well for an animated role, but the second he gets into live action, it just falls apart. The whole structure of this movie overall is just an absolute clusterfuck. Like, characters will just change their motivations randomly or straight up forget their motivations and just go on weird little side quests that have nothing to do with the plot. Little extra tidbits and references will be put into place just to be called back on totally randomly, like really far into the movie when you totally forgot that they were set up in the first place. Characters will just enter and exit the story at really random moments. The whole thing is it's just a mess, man. Basic logic and questioning is just not in this movie, even from like the totally normal human characters who don't want to put up with Harold's nonsense. For example, there's just very clearly magic shenanigans occurring for most of the movie, but Zooey Deschanel's character doesn't find out about it until the climax because that's just how this character archetype works in movies. Even though the minute she meets Harold, she's like, oh man, I wish I had a tire, and then he pulls this weird looking purple tire out of thin air, and she's like, oh, thanks, appreciate it. That doesn't trigger any alarms in your head. And then the next morning she wakes up and her whole house is now purple, and there's like 50,000 pies in her kitchen. And she asks her son what happened, and her son is like, oh, Harold has a magic crayon, so he drew all this stuff for us. And she's like, yeah, sure. Stop using your imagination, my 12-year-old child who I'm letting play with these weird adult men. It's just a baffling movie, man. There's no better word for it than baffling. This kid character also gets half of Harold's purple crayon like 20 to 25 minutes into the movie, even though the scene before that was Harold and this kid having a bonding moment where the kid draws a venomous monster that Harold has to run away from, and like it just gets to roam free in the world, I guess. They don't really deal with it. But for some reason, after this really awesome moment that the two share, Harold is like, oh, it's a great idea for me to give you the other half of this crayon. And then the kid doesn't even use the other half of the crayon for another like 40 minutes. It's like he forgot he got it. I mean, me personally, if I'm a 12-year-old with an overactive imagination, I think I'm pulling that crayon out at the first opportunity, not waiting like a full day before I'm like, it's an emergency. I think I finally got to use the crayon. How about instead of having the kid draw a venomous monster that they have to run away from, he drew something kind of cute and sweet that Harold really liked, and that would be even better if he could draw it in multiple colors, so that when Harold gives him half of the crayon, it is an actual nice sweet moment of the two connecting even further. And then at the very end of the movie, when the kid gives him the colored crayon box set, it brings everything full circle. It's not that hard. There's just no work being put in here at all. It's like a vomit draft from a pair of writers who really did not want to make the movie. It is genuinely so soulless. So I think you guys can probably predict what my score of this movie is. It's just a big fat 1 star. It would genuinely be 0 stars if not for that opening cute little 5 minutes, and for the fact that I actually really liked the villain in this movie. Not as a villain, but as a character who shows up in like weird little chunks throughout the story. He's actually really funny. Like, I was unironically laughing at a lot of his jokes, and he's just such an insane character that he's just really fun to watch. Like, the actor, once again, like the Porcupine Girl, really knew what to do with this weird, strange character, and he locked in, he put in an actual good, funny performance here. The villain is basically a failed writer and a Redditor who's obsessed with Zooey Deschanel and wants to be her husband and the father to this side kid, which is as creepy as it sounds, and he plays that up pretty well. But for some reason, this movie decided the best ending for this villain character is to give him everything he wants. Harold draws a door to the writer's failed books world. The guy gets to step inside and he becomes a knight or a king or whatever, and a copy of Zooey Deschanel is there and in love with him, and he gets to spend his days there. And then there's a really weird joke where they burn the door down and they're like, we better just leave him in there. But like, they specifically point out how weird it is that he's obsessed with Zooey Deschanel and that they gave him a clone of her, essentially, but they don't want to deal with the horrifying ramifications of that. They just think it's funny to burn the door and be like, he might as well not even exist anymore. That is just, once again, such a baffling ending. It also feels like they could have done something with the fact that this failed writer basically gets the powers of a god and he still loses because he just doesn't imagine anything all that good or powerful. He just tries to make his story real and his story sucks. so he loses this fight against Harold. There is something cool that you could do and play around with that, about the fact, like I said, that he's a failed writer, and even with the powers of a god, he couldn't make all of this work. But that would just be way too much work for this movie to put into its script. So obviously there's nothing about that. It's just a boring, awkward finale. So yeah, moral of the story, don't watch this movie. Don't even think about this movie. I don't think I have to tell you that based on the box office. But yeah, that's all I got for Harold and the Purple Crayon, starring Zachary Levi as Harold. So yeah, guys, that's going to be all from me today. Like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you liked it even more than that, and keep it crispy.